Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, brought to you by Lace Partners. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard from Lace Partners, back again as always on this Thursday. Today's podcast is one that I've been fascinated about because we've sort of touched upon once or twice in a few podcasts that we've done in the couple of hundred podcasts that we've done over the years. I've often asked the question, which is around who looks after HR when HR is looking after everyone else. And so I didn't come across a report. My co-host today, so I'll introduce her first, Debbie Mitchell from Lace Partners. Debbie, you all right?
Hello, Chris Howard.
I was about to take all the glory there and say I came across this report, but in fact, it was you that came across this report, wasn't it?
That's correct.
The HR Mental Wellbeing Report, which was produced by the fabulous people at Ultimate Resilience. And so you sent it to me and said, we should get these guys on and have a chat about this because
yes, I did.
HR mental well-being, again, kind of linked to that, who's looking after HR, fascinating topic. So let's introduce one of the authors of the report first. It's Dr. Jo Burrell, who is a clinical psychologist, coach, and co-founder of Ultimate Resilience. How are you doing, Jo? You all right?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
It's been lovely to get you on. I think we've been trying to get this one done for a while, actually, and get you guys on. So it's been good to get you guys on. And we've got a special guest as well, a fourth person to this particular party. And it is Rachel Jones, who is the Director of People and Change at Sodexo, to give us a insider's view, the practitioner's voice. Rachel, how are you doing? You all right?
I'm very good, thank you. Very much looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, it should be a really, really interesting one. But as is our want on the HR on the Offensive podcast, we cannot start any podcast without a fundamentally different question because we are a fundamentally different HR consultancy. I am going to ask Debbie the question first so that we give our guests a moment or two to compose themselves. Debbie,
yes.
There is an article that I have recently read that the city of Milan are trying to ban ice cream pizzas and other takeaway food after a certain period of time because they're trying to preserve the tranquility in the city. If the City of London or anywhere in the UK decided that they were going to ban a certain foodstuff, maybe after like 6 p.m, what would be your go-to that you would choose? And I'll give you mine first. I can't get away from steak-flavoured crisps. I'm not going to name the brand names, obviously, but steak-flavoured crisps are my kryptonite. What's yours?
Interesting. Well, it depends whether you're talking about takeaway, in which case I'm going to have to go with, this is going to give away how very rock and roll I am, by the way. I'm going to go with a banana milkshake because I just don't think you can beat I won't also repeat the brand name, but Golden Arches banana milkshake. But if yours is just a snack, it's not a takeaway. So if it's just a snack, I'm afraid it's a chocolate digestive, plain chocolate digestive. That's where I'm going.
Wow. So you've got a couple there. Let's start
together
with
would be ideal.
That would be together. Jo, what are you going for?
Well, when you first asked the question, I immediately thought wine, I have to say.
Yeah, that's a good shout.
Which I know doesn't count because it's not a food, but I'm just being honest and saying and declaring from the outset that I would seriously struggle if I couldn't have a glass of wine in the evening. I'm not saying every night, obviously, but if we're talking food, I would go plain chocolate too. Dark chocolate I love. Absolutely love. I would struggle. Yeah, I would struggle to do without that.
Wow. So we've got wine, we've got crisps, we've got Golden Arches, and we've got chocolate. Rachel, just to complete the set before we actually start talking about things about within HR, what are you going for?
Bring some class, Rachel.
I don't think I am. I'm really a bagel.
Just a plain without anything on, or?
No, I am very much a cup of tea and bagel lady come the end of the evening. Normally about 10 p.m, which is very, very bad for me.
Well, we have an election coming up in the near future in 2024. So if anybody from powers that be that are listening in, please do not impose any restrictions on any of those foodstuffs or drinkables that we have mentioned. Right, let's talk about the HR Mental Wellbeing Report. Jo, we might be worth actually doing let's do a bit of an intro check first. So could you tell our wonderful listeners a little bit about yourself, and then Rachel as well? We'll just get you to do a little bit of that, and then we'll talk about the report.
Sure. So as you said, I'm Dr. Jo Burrell. I'm a clinical psychologist and coach. I spent about 25 years working in the NHS in mental health services as a clinician and leader. And about 10 years ago, I set up a company called Ultimate Resilience along with another clinical psychologist, Dr. Felicity Baker. And we deliver evidence-based coaching and training into all manner of organisations to support the mental well-being and resilience of staff right across the board.
Lovely. Rachel?
Yeah, I've been in HR now for just over 20 years. I've also worked in retail as an operator. And similar to Jo, I have a real passion in understanding people. So I have a psychology degree and a sociology degree and OD. So I really like to map all of those together to obviously have an output from a people point of view.
Lovely. Right, let's talk about this report because there's some really, really interesting findings that came out of it. We're going to go into some of the different bits of the findings, and I'll probably get Debbie to actually get a word in edgeways as my co-host and maybe kick us off with the first findings. But before we do that, can you just give us a little bit of background to the report, like why did you write it, a little bit of synopsis of who you surveyed, that sort of stuff?
Sure. I guess we got to know, I'm not an HR professional myself, but we got to know quite a lot of HR professionals during the 10-year course of our business, lifetime of our business, because HR professionals are typically our kind of first port of call. They're often the people who commission our services. So they come to us typically because they're looking for some support for their staff, whether it's some training or coaching. So they're coming on behalf of their staff in their organisations, looking for services that are going to support their staff around managing stress and building resilience and so on. And so we got some quite long-standing close relationships with a lot of HR professionals now, having been, in operation for 10 years. And I guess what was interesting, what we noticed was that post-pandemic, suddenly loads of HR professionals started to come to us asking for help for themselves. And that really hadn't happened very much before. So we were noticing a shift. Clearly there were more and more HR professionals identifying that they were struggling themselves in terms of their mental well-being and starting to reach out, saying, can you come to our away day and do a session? Or we've got a member of our team who's really struggling and needs some coaching. So we wondered what's going on here. Why is this happening that suddenly people are coming forward in such high numbers? And I thought, well, I wonder what data's out there already to tell us about the mental well-being of HR professionals. And I had a quick search and I found actually there was very little information out there. In fact, if you do a Google search and you put in HR wellbeing, what you get is lots of information about how HR can help other people's wellbeing and support other people's wellbeing. You get very little at all on how HR can support their own wellbeing or what's around for HR to support their wellbeing. And indeed, even the CIPD have only just introduced a couple of questions about wellbeing into their member survey that they do on a regular basis. So I was like, well, there's very little data out there. Well, let's do a survey ourselves. We come from a research background. We've got published research. We could do this. So it's kind of an experiment, really. We're just interested to find out what's out there. What does the data tell us? So we designed a survey and we looked at things like depression symptoms, anxiety symptoms, symptoms of burnout, levels of well-being. We also asked about the sort of support that they were accessing at work. We had a total of 91 respondents, largely through email and LinkedIn. We just put it together and put it out there to see what happened. We had 91 respondents, which is not a massive number. We can't say this is a wholly representative group of the profession, because of course the profession is massive. But I think what it did was, it being one of the first, probably the first survey of its kind, it's really shone a spotlight on a problem that we knew was there already. But I guess having some hard data really helps us to understand the degree of the problem. So we had 91 respondents, most of them female, around 90% female. And about 45% were people who'd been in the profession for 15 years plus. So actually that was our largest group in terms of number of years of experience in the profession.
It's interesting, Jo, that you mentioned post-pandemic as being sort of a trigger point in your mind. But do you consider that the pandemic was a shift in how the HR function felt or was perceived, or the pressure it was under? Because I read that quite a lot. It was and I'd be interested in your view as well in a minute, Rachel, but it was a pivotal point for HR, because suddenly we're dealing with this completely unknown context, and between IT and HR, we were the two functions that really had to come to the fore. So, but is that a cause and effect, or is that just it's a side issue?
Simple answer, I think it's a complex picture, because my feeling is, having got to know a lot of HR professionals and got to know, got quite close to the profession, my feeling is there are some kind of systemic issues that have been around for a long time in the culture of the profession that were there way before the pandemic, and probably meaning that there was some vulnerabilities. And then the pandemic came along, and that just added this additional degree of pressure, level of pressure. And as you said, a whole raft of new challenges, unprecedented challenges being thrown at a profession. And we think about key workers and the people who are most affected in the pandemic. And we think about, healthcare workers and supermarket staff and bus drivers and people like that. We don't really think about HR professionals, but actually they were really in the eye of the storm, weren't they?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think in addition, there's something else worth saying, which is that there was no let up. So as soon as the pandemic stopped, or, gradually it passed as a crisis, there was another thing and another thing and another thing. So you've got the Great Resignation, you've got the cost of living crisis, you've got hybrid working policy, you've got to bring in, so there's just been no let up for people.
Yeah. So just before we get into some of the more detailed results, Rachel, I'd just be interested in your perspective on sort of that turning point, or whether you see it differently.
Yeah, look, lots of frantic shaking of my head and agreeing with Jo in terms of just listening to that. I mean, there's multiple responses. I mean, just listening to Jo and then reading the insight, I almost liken HR to being a parent. It's just a given then that you know what you're doing and that every choice is going to be the right choice. But sometimes you're winging it every single day. And yes, you have legislation and policy that, of course, you can adhere to. But fundamentally, sometimes you're facing something for the first time and you're just hoping that you're making the right choice and decision. And that was in COVID and after COVID, that was just heightened hugely. And you also witnessed multiple changes of people in complexity at the same point. So people that you'd worked with for multiple years and might have always had a certain profile or type of, they're the unbreakable character, as an example, broke. That affects you then differently to someone that that you need to support differently. And I think you was just constantly facing numerous situations and scenarios that had never played out and at that speed and pace. And actually, as with all businesses, you was having to make choices and decisions very quickly. And some of those choices and decisions were not a quick choice or decision. And again, as a HR professional, of course, we have empathy. You want to make the right choice. You are responsible not only for your employees, but their families and friends, because we will impact them based on a choice and a decision that we make. So everything that Jo says there just absolutely resonated. It was really difficult, and there's been no let up since.
Yeah. Thanks, Rachel. It's a really interesting sort of reflection, isn't it? But Jo, do you want to just talk us through some of the kind of key highlights from the report, and then we'll delve into a few bits of the detail?
So we used a selection of standardised measures. These are questionnaires that people could just tick as they went through. We designed a questionnaire that was relatively quick and easy to complete, because we know people don't fill in long, lengthy questionnaires. So for symptoms of depression, what we found that 65% of respondents were experiencing some symptoms of depression, low mood and depression, and 46% met the clinical threshold for depression. So experiencing clinically significant levels of depression, 46%. And that's in fact 3 times higher than we would expect to see in the normal population, in the general population. So that's quite a stark finding. And similarly for anxiety, 2.5 times higher than we would expect to see in the general population of clinical levels of symptoms of anxiety. And then we found 48% of people experiencing at least one symptom of burnout, and 57% scoring in the low range for well-being. And then finally, we asked people, do you currently feel supported at work in relation to your mental well-being? And only 22% said very well supported. So we're left with 78% who feel that the support that they're receiving is lacking to some degree. And I guess one of the concerns about that is that we have a big gap then between the rates of people experiencing significant levels of distress and difficulty, such that they're in the clinical range. We have a big gap between those rates and the rates of people who feel they're being sufficiently supported. There's a big gap between those two figures. You know, that was a particular concern, I think, for us.
I was reading through the report and just interested in what might some of the reasons be behind sort of that, particularly around the depression and anxiety part. So I think it's probably easier to connect to sort of why might people feel burnt out. You can, you know, some of what we've just talked about, some of those things. But what kind of things did you pick up from the search?
Burnout is a significant risk factor for depression. I think we're talking about the same things, really. And both anxiety and depression are often reactive conditions. They happen as a result of people facing challenge and difficulty in life, whether that's grief, you know, whether that's high levels of work stress, whatever it is. You know, when we're going through difficult times, when we're experiencing high levels of stress, we become more vulnerable to developing these clinical conditions and clinical levels of symptoms that actually we might experience day to day. You know, we all have low days.
Yeah.
We all have days when we feel a bit agitated and restless, or we don't sleep so well, or so we're experiencing these things. But actually, when stress and challenge gets really high, then we become vulnerable to developing these things at a more clinical level. So they're becoming more persistent, more regular feature in our lives, and they're impacting our functioning. I guess that's the way we define a condition like that, is it is impacting our functioning significantly, that we're struggling with work, we're struggling with our day-to-day lives much more than we would do normally. So I just think it's about the challenge and the levels of stress that people have been facing. And this is the upshot.
I talked right at the beginning of the pod about getting a practitioner's view on that. So I'd love to get, Rachel, your thoughts on this. Is there any of those stats that kind of surprised you? Because you obviously have your own HR networks, you know, you're talking to various peers across all different industry types, turning up to events, your own network. Is there anything in there that you would pick out and say, that's an interesting one, I totally get that, or not sure about that? Anything that stood out?
I think all of them have their place. I think the thing for me that stands out is around that low mood. And it goes back to, it was continuous. And I think there is huge resilience that is demonstrated in HR. And there's also huge support amongst HR professionals. But I think what was also playing at exactly the same time was, and I think it's easy to forget it now and miss the point, was around people all of a sudden then had far more home life come into play in effect with work life. You know, so I was hearing people within the HR professional family and outside of the HR professional family saying, I've taken my child to school, I've picked my child up from school, and I don't want to stop that now. And then they're in that whole dilemma and complex situation of, how do I give that up versus still do work? And when there's more work demand coming in, and then equally people, and it sounds really basic, but most things start as basic and just start to creep and build. People got a dog because they were working from home more, and then they was anxious to leave the dog when they was returning back to work or traveling again. And actually, micros become macro. And I think that sometimes is what's forgotten, because when you strip it back and you peel back a conversation, it's not one big thing that affects people. And especially in, you know, anxiety, low mood, depression, it's multiple layers of, I call it the Jenga tower, that then just create that topple effect. So I think all of it has its place genuinely. And I think the one thing that I would say in everything that Jo has shared is it hasn't stopped, has not slowed down, and it's given us no insight that it's going to slow down.
And it's really interesting how it's almost before the pandemic, there was clearer separation. The pandemic merged everything together. And now we're sort of living the consequences, it's not consequences because that sounds like a bad thing, but the new reality of that, right? So it is that sort of how you manage some of that separation.
And that's real, because that's where the Great Resignation came from. People saying, I don't want to do this 60, 70, 80, 90-hour week anymore. Or I want to do a job that holds more meaning or purpose and go and work for the NHS or go and work for the police. It stopped a lot of people. It made them re-question and reevaluate. And I think some people probably made that choice quicker than others. Other people might have had imposter syndrome or was considering or reflecting. But it was certainly a really interesting time and continues to be.
Do you know what you were just saying there, Rachel? It's just got me thinking on something. And I just wanted to get your view before we then just go back to Jo, because you were talking about people thinking more about purpose. And I wonder if there's a kind of employee value proposition angle here where businesses need to start reevaluating, because the deal, if you like, and we just talked about this just before we went live, maybe has changed a little bit, because it's no longer, right, well, you're working for me and it doesn't matter if you believe in what the company do or not. You're going to get paid. So, all right, maybe that's a bit of a 80s, 90s or, pre-circa 80s, 90s view. Maybe life has changed a little bit more. But do you think that was slightly accelerated? Because what triggered me asking that question, Rachel, was just what you were saying about job purpose. People suddenly saying, well, actually, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to do something that gives me purpose. What's your kind of view on that?
I think fundamentally COVID accelerated many different conversations that probably would have took 5, 10, 15 or 20 years to get to, hybrid, flexible workings, etc. But I think from an EVP point of view, that employee value proposition, it almost became a level playing field of employee and employer, that the employee was saying, these are my non-negotiables now. And if you don't meet my non-negotiables, I will leave. And because that was playing alongside the Great Resignation, the whole who held the currency changed completely. So it's really interesting. And I think a lot of businesses just had to understand, what was their EVP? Was it right? Was it reflective? Was it fit for purpose? And did it need to adjust or evolve?
I always think it's really interesting as well that in HR, and you allude to this a little bit in the report, Jo, but in HR, you're feeling that and you're dealing with other people feeling that, right? So you may have that kind of dilemma around purpose or, should you resign? Should you stay? Is the value right for you? But you're also striving to deliver the best for the colleagues around you, for the rest of the business. So it's that, back to your fundamental question, Jo, who's looking after HR? Because you have those kind of challenges for yourself as well as having to deal with them for the business. I just wanted to come back to the report and to talk a little bit about the burnout aspect, Jo. And there's some interesting stats in the report as well, around 43% feeling emotionally drained from work and 48% feeling used up by the end of the day. Again, talk to us a little bit about some of those sort of burnout numbers and what you were sort of seeing through the research.
I guess I was particularly shocked to find that 48% experiencing at least one symptom of burnout. So that was the one that got the most responses, was feeling used up at the end of my workday. So I guess that tells us something about the impact that work is having on people. And there's a lot more talk about burnout nowadays, isn't there? People are talking about it all the time. And I guess we're all, maybe I think it is the upshot of this conversation we've already been having, which is work has taken up loads of our time and kind of infiltrated into our lives in all sorts of different ways. And the boundary between work and the rest of our life has completely gone. For many of us, it's become very blurred, and the pandemic quickened that up, I think. And now we've got home working and hybrid working and all of those sorts of things that to throw into the mix. And suddenly we can be sending emails at midnight and, planning for that project at 2 a.m, because the technology allows us to do that. And I think that has just massively contributed to these rates of burnout. And it's the reason why we're talking about it so much, because in HR, the interesting thing is that there is a culture of head down and carry on. There's a real, because I think there's a kind of expectation, you just suck it all up and you carry on regardless. And what they say about burnout is that it hits you like a steam train suddenly out of nowhere, and you're flat on your face, and you can't even get out of bed in the morning. And I guess that happens when you feel like the expectation is that you just have to keep going and keep going and keep going and keep going, that you probably go into a bit of denial. And we know that that's a feature of the earlier stages of burnout, that people experience some denial. They think, just put this in place, or I'll just do that, I'll make this change, or I just keep going because next week it'll be better, or next month it'll be better, and then of course it isn't better, and coped before, so I should be able to carry on coping. But I think we've all got limits. That's the reality. We're all human beings, and we've got limits. There are limits to our capacity, and what we're seeing in terms of the results is people reaching their limits. That's it.
And I think the other interesting reflection then is the point you made at the beginning there about the degree of support and that gap, because that's a big gap. And you sort of talked about the 22% don't feel at all supported. Another 26% feel rarely supported. And if you're rarely supported as you approach burnout or as you're experiencing anxiety, it's not going to help, right? So I guess it would be useful to start to talk about some of the stuff we should be doing or could be doing. And what kind of things, again, we should be fair, right? So 22% said they felt very supported. And I just wonder what kind of things you heard about or experienced sort of in that more positive angle that we should be doing more of in terms of supporting our HR colleagues.
Well, I think we need to be talking about, and if that's the first thing, I think there's a bit of a conspiracy of silence that goes on in the profession. That's my view, having got to know lots of HR professionals and something of the kind of culture of the profession. It feels to me like there's a real difficulty acknowledging even that our mental well-being matters because there are such high expectations. There is this expectation to kind of deal with everything, deal with anything that gets thrown at me, and then just keep going regardless. It's sort of almost an expectation to be superhuman. And the reality is no one's superhuman. No one can deal with everything. And I think that when you're faced with an expectation that you should be superhuman, there's real shame about putting your hand up and saying, I'm not superhuman and I can't cope. There's a real shame that comes with that. And actually, if we can all be saying, none of us are superhuman, and we're all going to reach a wall sometimes, and we're all going to struggle sometimes, and things are going to be difficult, and we're going to notice that we're feeling stressed, and we're going to experience symptoms of stress and all that kind of stuff. This is normal stuff. It normalizes it. It helps us all then to be kind of more open about what's going on for us. It becomes just generally normalized. And if we're talking more openly about it, then of course, we're more likely to be able to support each other. Because if no one says I'm struggling, then we all believe that everyone's fine, that we have to carry on and pretend we're fine when we're not. So there's just a basic thing, I think, about talking about it. But I think there's also something really important about people in more leadership positions in HR setting an example. I think that because everyone's so busy, it's hard to set that example, particularly when you're in a senior leadership position, when you're dealing with lots of stuff. But actually, if you're not setting the example, if you're not making sure you take your annual leave and working reasonable hours rather than stupid hours, if you're not doing those things, then you're not giving permission to your staff to do them either. They automatically feel that that's what they should be doing too. If you're sending emails at midnight, they feel that's what they should be doing too.
Yeah. And sometimes that's what the perception that that's what success looks like.
Absolutely.
Or what is required for success or career progression.
And some people talk about work stress being a badge of honor kind of thing, don't they? It's just not. You're exposing yourself to only things like depression and burnout and those sorts of things, but actually chronic stress is associated with higher rates of heart disease, stroke, diabetes. You're exposing yourself to all manner of risks if you're experiencing chronic stress.
I'd love to hear Rachel's thoughts around this as well, in terms of what is the stuff that HR teams, HR leaders can do you think, to support more?
I think the good thing is we're having this podcast and we're talking about it. There's always a start point. I feel really blessed that in the HR professional family that I work within, there is that genuine open community where we can pick up the phone and have a conversation and almost not compete, can just be really vulnerable with each other. And this is a genuine plug to Lace. I obviously join your community. And again, there's that space to just breathe and just say, I don't know the answer to that question, or can someone help me, please? And you're not then feeling like, why don't you know the answer to that question? So I just think sometimes we put far too much pressure on ourselves. We manage ourselves harder than the business would ever manage us. There was a fantastic piece of work that we've done around empathetic leadership, and we started with HR because it was critical for us to be empathetic to ourselves to then deliver that into the business.
Amazing.
I think there's multiple tools that are there for us. We just need to listen to our own advice and just treat ourselves how we would one of our people, because we are a person. And a little bit like first time I went on a plane with my child and they said, put your oxygen mask on before you help anyone else. And I thought, no, I'd never put mine on before I put it on my child. Like, that's ridiculous. I'm no help if I've passed out. But it's being in a safe community and having someone within your profession that will call you out and will be your blind spot and just say, what are you doing? Stop, slow down, don't commit to that project. But there is so much out there. Put yourself. I always say the monster in the mirror is yourself. I say that all the time.
That's a really, really interesting and a profound kind of way of looking at it. It's taking that look in the mirror and making sure that, you know, I like the analogy you gave about the oxygen masks as well there, Rachel, as well. Unfortunately, we're out of time, which is annoying because I had about 6 other questions that I needed to ask. So maybe we'll have to do a round 2. I've got questions around things like, what does the impact of this sort of stuff have on incoming talent of the HR profession? There's all sort of areas like that could be explored. Maybe that's something that we might do a round 2 on. But for today, unfortunately, we are out of time. Just want to say thank you, as always, Debbie Mitchell, for joining me, co-host Supremo.
Thank you very much for having me.
As always, Jo, thank you very much for being part of the show and sharing some of the interesting stats from your report as well.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And last but certainly by no means least, Rachel, thank you very much for joining us to give us that HR practitioner view too.
No, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
It's been great to have all of you guys on. Of course, you can get this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. I won't go through all of the different channels, but I'm sure you can find it. If you want to find out any more of the content that we put together, we've done a few podcasts on Wellbeing. We've done a few around employee value proposition that we've mentioned as well. So what we'll do is we'll put a link to the report as well so that you can download that in the show notes of this podcast as well. You can access any of our content on lacepartners.co.uk/insights. But from myself, from Debbie, from Jo and from Rachel, thank you very much once again for listening. And hopefully we'll catch you on the next time on the HR on the Offensive podcast. Bye-bye.